I don't check locks anymore. That habit died the morning I realized the door was never mine to close. The real theft, the one that took 15 years to surface, wasn't what they said I stole. It was the 2 years they made me believe I had nothing left to stand on. The brass key weighs almost nothing, green ribbon faded to the color of old newspaper, edges soft from being touched too many times by hands that needed something solid to hold. I still carry it, though the lock it opens hasn't been locked in 3 years. Some things you keep not because they're useful, but because they're the only proof you didn't imagine it. At 29, I had a master's degree in geotechnical engineering and $11 in my checking account. The degree lived in a drawer. The $11 bought me 3 days of insulin and a week of deciding which bill could wait. I worked night shifts at a garden center called Greenfield Nursery, the only place in a 4,000-person town that would put my name on a timesheet. Not because I was good at the work, though I was. Because the night manager had never heard the story. Here's what 2 years of being called a thief looks like when you live it: interviews that go cold between the handshake and the callback. Grocery store aisles you learn to avoid because someone's cousin works there and the silence is worse than the staring. A town that decides who you are in a kitchen you grew up in, and no amount of receipts, spreadsheets, or truth changes the vote. I stopped crying around month 4. Crying requires an audience that believes tears mean something. Mine had been shown a different script, and I wasn't in it as the victim. So I kept my head down, logged every hour, dated every invoice, kept the kind of records engineers keep when the ground beneath them has already failed once. And I waited. Not for rescue, for a question no one had bothered to ask: what, exactly, was I supposed to have stolen? Because in 2 years, no one ever showed me a number. To tell it right, I have to take you back to the hill. Summer, 2011, heat that made the air thick enough to chew. My grandmother, Vivian, ran a roadside nursery on 22 acres of sloped land her father had cleared with a mule and a blade. She wasn't warm the way grandmothers in commercials are warm. She was sharp, efficient, the kind of woman who said your name once and expected you to remember hers. That July, she walked me along the property line, post to post, made me recite the boundaries out loud until I could draw them in my sleep. At the top, she handed me a key. Brass, small, threaded on a green ribbon that had already faded by the time it touched my palm. Potting shed, she said, the maps live in there, so do you now. A little. I didn't understand that part. I was 16, I thought she was being poetic. We sat on the porch after, drinking tea she grew herself, lemon balm, sharp and green, faintly sweet, and she unrolled a survey map across the table, held the corners down with jam jars, traced the lines with one fingertip, slow and deliberate. Land has a memory people don't, she said. Land remembers, people forget on purpose. I was 16. I thought she was talking about soil erosion. Years later, I'd understand she was surveying something else entirely, the fault lines in her own family, marking where the ground would give. That afternoon, tea, ribbon, map under jam jars, was the start of everything. I just couldn't read the slope yet. The stroke came in 2018. Small, quiet, the kind that steals words but leaves the mind sharp enough to know what's missing. Someone had to move in. My mother had reasons, her hours, her back, her nerves, a word she wielded like a doctor's note. My sister had 2 kids and a calendar she treated like gospel. So I moved into the room off Vivian's kitchen. I was 23, just finished grad school, drowning in loans and good intentions. I stayed 6 years. I learned to manage medications, coordinate specialists, argue with insurance companies who spoke in denials. I held her healthcare power of attorney, which meant I signed the forms and made the calls and showed up to every appointment 40 minutes away because she refused to see anyone local. I'm a document by nature. Engineer training, maybe, or just the way my brain works. Every number needs a reason, every withdrawal needs a note, so I kept everything: receipts, logs, spreadsheets color-coded by category. Groceries, copays, the ramp I had built for the porch because she couldn't do stairs anymore. I wasn't building a defense. I just couldn't not do it. My mother visited maybe once a month, stood in the doorway with her coat on, asked if the will was settled yet, like Vivian was already gone and the paperwork was just slow. My sister came on holidays, took pictures of herself fluffing pillows and posted them with captions about blessed to serve. Near the end, Vivian started talking about the hill. Not the nursery, the hill. It's handled, she'd say, don't you worry about the hill. Once, I heard her on the phone with her lawyer, Harriet Voss, a woman older than plumbing, say, keep that piece separate from the rest. I assumed she meant the taxes. I assumed a lot of things. The one thing I never assumed was that loving her up close, feeding her, washing her, holding her hand while she forgot words, would someday be rewritten as the crime they'd used to bury me. Vivian died in the spring. 86. In her own bed, window open, quiet. 2 weeks later, we sat in Harriet Voss's office for the will reading. My mother wore her good coat. My sister brought a legal pad, which should have told me something. The will was simple, almost boring. House contents, split 3 ways, savings account, divided evenly, a few small bequests to people I'd never met. My mother's jaw tightened with every paragraph. She was waiting for the part that didn't come. The hill. 22 acres, prime development land, 10 minutes from the train station. The will never mentioned it. Not as hers, not as ours, not as anyone's. Harriet read to the end, set the papers down, folded her hands. That concludes the estate, she said. My mother's voice came out thin, tight. Where's the property? Where's mother's land? Harriet's face didn't move. The land was otherwise arranged, not part of the estate. I'm not at liberty to say more. My mother stood so fast her chair scraped. Outside in the parking lot, she went gray, actually gray, the color of someone watching a number they'd been counting dissolve into air. I didn't gloat. I didn't even understand it. I thought maybe a land trust, maybe the county, maybe some charity Vivian had loved in private. I had no idea the land had a name on it. And that the name was mine. My mother needed an explanation that wasn't the truth. So she built one. Within a week, the story had shape. I'd moved in on a sick old woman, isolated her, manipulated her, walked away with everything that wasn't nailed down. Never mind the will split everything evenly. Never mind I was the one who'd buried her. My mother sat across from me at her kitchen table, the one I'd eaten at as a child, and turned 6 years of caregiving inside out. The copays? Skimming. The groceries? Patting. The ramp I'd paid for myself? Redecorating her house to keep her in it. I sat there and listened to my own life renamed. And then I said, I have receipts for every dollar, you're welcome to read them. She didn't want receipts. Receipts would have ruined the story. What she wanted was the version where I understood then. This was never about money. It was about 30 years of standing in doorways with her coat on while Vivian poured tea for me. The land was just the last proof she couldn't argue with. So she went to war over a feeling. And the first weapon she reached for was my name. My father made most of the calls. Wendell ran a small excavation company, site prep, grading, nothing fancy, but he'd been in the valley 40 years. He knew every contractor, every shop owner, every hiring manager. He didn't need to be clever. He just needed to be connected. He'd call someone, drop his voice into something confidential, say his daughter had trouble with money in the family and they should be careful. That's all. No specifics. Specifics can be disproved. He traded in fog. And in a town of 4,000, fog from a man like Wendell settles into every crack. I'd interview well. I'm good at interviews, it's the one social thing I can do. Then the air would change on the second call. The position would go to someone else, someone whose last name didn't come with a warning. Twice, I watched a hiring manager's face do the math mid-handshake. Once, a woman at the county office walked me to the elevator and whispered, "Honey, talk to your mother." That was the closest anyone came to saying it out loud. I called my father, asked him straight. He didn't deny it. He told me a daughter who'd done what I did couldn't expect a free ride, that maybe a couple hard years would teach me something. Then he said the line I'll carry to my grave. Maybe now you'll learn to respect us. He said it the way you'd forecast weather, calm, factual. As if my whole career going dark was just a season I'd brought on myself. The diner on Main is where the town does its remembering out loud. So of course that's where it happened. I was at the counter, coffee, job listings on my phone, trying to find something, anything, within 100 miles that hadn't heard the name Thatcher yet. My sister walked in with 2 friends from her church committee. She clocked me from the door. And decided to perform. Her voice pitched across the room, loud enough to be overheard, casual enough to have deniability. "Paygram back yet, Inzi?" The friends laughed, uncertain, but they laughed. Heads turned. A man I'd known since Little League studied his eggs like they contained answers. I felt the heat climb my neck, the old instinct to explain, defend, fix it, but I did the thing Vivian taught me without ever saying it. I slowed down. I set a 5 on the counter for a $2 coffee. I closed my phone. I put my hand in my pocket and held the brass key, the green ribbon. Let it remind me there was a thing in this world that was actually true, even if no one in this diner believed it yet. I stood. Told the waitress to keep it. And walked out without giving my sister the scene she'd ordered. Behind me, through the closing door, I heard a voice. Old, steady. "Mrs. Dolan, bought tomato starts from Vivian for 30 years. Your grandmother knew her own mind," she said. Not to me, to the room. It was the first time in 2 years anyone in that town had said a single word in my defense. And it came from an 80-year-old woman buying pie. I held on to that. Billboard went up in April. Bottom of the hill where the nursery sign used to be. Crane Hill Commons, a new neighborhood, coming 2027. Brandt Calder Development Group. Seeing my grandmother's hill, her actual hill, rendered into glassy townhomes on a billboard did something to my stomach I didn't have words for. The town lit up. Development that size meant jobs, tax base, a sleepy train station town finally getting noticed. My family lit up brightest. Within days, my father was telling everyone who'd listened that his crew was lined up for site prep. Ground floor of the whole thing, he kept saying, poor choice of words for a man whose ground had legal problems he didn't know about yet. My mother let people congratulate her on selling mother's land to the right people. My sister posted about exciting things for our family. They were taking victory laps. And I stood at the bottom of the hill with my neck craned up at that billboard, doing engineer math. Because something didn't add up. The will never named the land. Harriet said it was otherwise arranged. If the hill had left the estate, gone to a trust, a charity, anyone, then my mother had no more right to sell it than I had to sell the train station. So how was a multimillion-dollar developer about to break ground on 22 acres my family didn't legally own? 2 answers were possible. Either I was wrong. Or they were. I needed the maps to find out which. The estate sale was scheduled for Saturday. Which meant the shed, and everything in it, would be cleared with the rest. So I drove up Friday, dusk, house dark and empty. The auction company had tagged the furniture, but they hadn't bothered with the potting shed yet. I took the brass key off my ring. The lock was stiff, 2 years of disuse, but it gave on the second try, and the green ribbon swung against my wrist. Inside, it smelled like every summer of my childhood. Peat, cedar, the dry green ghost of lemon balm. The maps were where she'd always kept them, galvanized tube on the high shelf. I uncapped it, slid out the survey of Crane's Hill. The same one she'd weighted with jam jars when I was 16. But this copy had something the others didn't. Along the bottom margin, in her tight slanted hand, in pencil gone soft with age, held in trust, VC. And clipped to the corner, yellowed at the edges, a business card. Brandt Calder Development Group, Marshall Brandt, founder. I stood in that shed with the survey in one hand and the card in the other. And felt the slope of 2 years shift under me. Held in trust. Not sold, not lost. Held. My grandmother hadn't forgotten to mention the hill in her will. She'd taken it out of the will on purpose. Years before she died. And routed it somewhere my mother's hands couldn't reach. I just had to find out where it had landed. I'd love to tell you I cleverly connected the dots and marched on Brandt Calder with my grandmother's card held high. The truth is dumber. And more human. I needed a job, in my actual field. Brandt Calder was the biggest engineering employer within driving distance. And they had an opening. Junior geotechnical analyst. The card in the shed had rattled me, sure, but 2 years of rejection teaches you not to build cathedrals out of coincidences. A developer working in this county was always going to cross paths with my grandmother's parcel. That didn't mean the founder knew my name. So I did the practical thing. I scrubbed my resume, took out the hometown references, because my hometown references were a loaded gun, left the work, the degree, the projects. And I hit submit at 1 a.m. Expected the usual silence. 3 days later, the email came. And it was wrong in the best way. Not from HR. From the office of the founder. They wanted to schedule an interview. And the interview would be conducted by Marshall Brandt himself. I read it 4 times. CEOs of 100-person firms do not personally interview junior analysts who haven't worked in 2 years. Something was off. And after 2 years of off being a trap, I almost didn't go. Then I thought about the card, the pencil, the 4 words she'd left where only I would find them. Held in trust. I put on the one good blazer I owned. And I went. Marshall Brandt was a big man, late 50s, weathered, contractor's hands, the kind of stillness that didn't match the suit. He didn't sit behind the desk to start. He went to a side table where an electric kettle had just clicked off, poured 2 cups of tea without asking. And when he set one in front of me, the smell hit before the cup did. Sharp, green, I didn't have to ask whose. He sat, folded those big hands. And instead of opening the folder with my resume in it, he opened a drawer. And took out an envelope. Heavy paper, gone cream with age, flap sealed with wax that had cracked amber at the edges. He turned it so I could read the front. My name, in Vivian's slanted hand. Beneath it, a date. 15 years ago. The summer I was 16. He slid it across the desk the way you'd hand someone something fragile. Before we start, he said, I need to give you this. Your grandmother left it with strict instructions. I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. And I asked the only question I had. It came out barely a whisper. How did you know her? He almost smiled. There was something old in it, and sad. I've kept that in a drawer longer than you've had your degree, he said. She made me promise, when you came to me on your own, not before, I was to give it to you, and answer every question you asked. My hands were not steady. I set the tea down so I wouldn't spill it. He told me the rest before I opened it. Because, he said, I should understand the why before I read the what. 40 years ago, Marshall Brandt was 16, sleeping in a culvert off Route 9, a runaway from a house he wouldn't describe except to say leaving was the smart move. He was stealing tomatoes from a roadside nursery when the owner caught him. She didn't call the sheriff. She put him to work. Vivian gave him a job hauling pots, a cot in the back of the potting shed, fed him at her own table. And over 3 summers, she taught him how soil worked, how water moved, how to read a slope. The same things she taught me. In the same order. Everything I've built, he said, and he gestured at the glass, the city, the name on the wall, I built on what that woman taught a thief she could have turned in. He let the word sit. Thief. He'd heard what my family was saying. He'd known it was a lie before he ever met me. Because he'd been the actual hungry kid in that story. And she'd chosen to see something else. She never lent me a dime, he said. And I understood he was answering a question I hadn't known to ask. People think she must have bankrolled him. She didn't. She lent me a reason to stay alive. That kind of debt doesn't come due, and it doesn't expire. When she got old, he said, she'd called him with one request. Not money, not a favor for her. But a job, years down the line. To hold something steady for the granddaughter she was afraid for. He'd said yes before she finished asking. I broke the wax with my thumbnail. Slid out 3 things. The first was a legal document, blue-backed, notarized. I read the heading twice before the words would hold still. The VC, Legacy Trust, Successor Trustee, Marshall Brandt, Sole Beneficiari, ins Maritacer. The corpus of the trust was described in the dry language of deeds. But I knew the shape of it before I reached the metes and bounds. Because I'd recited those boundaries fence post to fence post when I was 16. 22 acres. Cranes Hill. Mine. Not split 3 ways, not contested, not otherwise arranged. Held since 2011 in an irrevocable trust. With my name as the only beneficiary. Waiting. The second thing was a copy of the same survey map I'd pulled from the galvanized tube 2 days before. Her pencil boundaries matching the legal description line for line. So there could be no argument about which dirt this was. And the third thing was a letter. I recognized the stationery, cream paper she used for things that mattered. Her hand, smaller now than 15 years ago, the way an old woman's writing draws in. Brandt saw me find it. Stood. I'll give you the room, he said, read it, then ask me anything. He walked out, pulled the door soft behind him. And I sat alone in a glass office with tea going cold and a deed to a hill in my lap. Holding a letter from a woman 2 years dead. And for the first time in 2 years, I let myself feel the exact size of what had been done to me. And the exact size of what she'd done to stop it. Long before any of them started. I won't read you the whole letter. Some of it is only mine. But I'll give you the spine of it. Because it's the spine of everything. She wrote that she'd watched her own daughter curdle over the years, watched my mother keep a ledger of every slight, real and imagined, and mistake being passed over for being robbed. She wrote that she knew, with the certainty of a woman who'd read people the way she read weather, that when she died, my mother would come for the hill. And that if the hill ever sat in a plain will, my mother would either take it or burn the family down trying. So in 2011, when I was 16, and she first saw the shape of me, she took the land out of reach. An irrevocable trust, drafted quiet by Harriet Voss. The one piece of her estate her daughter could never touch. With a single trigger she'd built like a lock. The trust would deliver to me only when I went to Marshall Brandt myself. When I'd grown into the kind of woman who'd find her own way to that door. She apologized for the years it might cost me in between. I'm sorry for what they'll say about you while you wait. I couldn't protect your name, I could only protect your ground. And then, near the end, the line she'd said to me on the porch when I was 16. Written out so I'd have it in her hand. Land remembers, people forget on purpose. She'd known they'd forget me on purpose. She'd known. And she'd planted the one thing in this world that wouldn't. When Brandt came back, I asked the question that had been climbing my throat the whole time I read. The Billboard, Crane Hill Commons, His project. On the hill the trust one just learned about controlled. He sat down heavily. Nodded. And I watched a developer with $100 million deal explain, calmly, that the deal had a hole in the bottom of it. Brandt Calder had spent 18 months assembling Crane Hill Commons. The anchor parcel, the 22 acres the whole site plan was drawn around, they'd been negotiating to acquire from the family that appeared to control it. From my mother and father, who'd presented themselves as Vivian's heirs, waved around facially valid probate paperwork, and signed a purchase agreement. Our title company flagged the trust in the first month, Brandt said. A parcel held in an irrevocable trust outside the estate freezes a clean sale on day one. On paper, your parents look like the people to deal with, so my acquisitions team kept negotiating while the title got cured. He paused. They never knew who the beneficiary was. The trust keeps that private. Another pause. And I didn't tell them. He let that sit. But I'm the successor trustee, and I've known for 15 years exactly whose interest I was holding. He'd known the whole time. And he'd let his own people chase a closing he understood was hollow. Slow walking it, keeping the date open. I wasn't going to break ground out from under the beneficiary, he said. Holding it steady meant waiting for you. So here was the full shape of it. My mother had branded me a thief over land she didn't own. Then tried to sell that same land to the one man on earth who knew exactly where the title sat. In trust. For me. Whatever she'd signed couldn't convey what was never hers. And Brandt Calder couldn't legally turn a single shovel of earth on Crane Hill Commons without the written consent of the trust's sole beneficiary. That was me. The groundbreaking was in 6 days. Brandt laid out my options like a man who'd thought about them on my behalf. For 2 years, my family had hurt me in public. And made me answer in private. The phone calls were quiet, my unemployment was loud. The Facebook posts were public, my receipts sat in a ledger no one would read. They'd built the lie out where everyone could see it. And made me carry the truth somewhere no one would look. A conference room letter would fix the law. And leave the lie standing in the town square. So I asked Brandt when the groundbreaking was, exactly, and who'd be there. He said, Saturday, 10 a.m., on the Hill, town supervisor, local paper, a couple hundred residents, gold shovels, a ribbon. He paused. And your family, front row, as the selling family. That's when I knew. I'd like to come, I said. Not to make a scene. To be accurate. Out loud. He studied me. And whatever he was looking for, he found. She'd have liked that, he said. She never raised her voice once in 40 years, and never lost an argument either. I wasn't going there to ruin my mother. I'd watched what ruin looked like for 2 years. And I had no appetite for handing it back. I was going there to set one thing down in front of witnesses. The truth. On the ground where it lived. And then walk off the hill that was finally, legally, mine. Saturday came up clear and warm. They'd tented the flat shoulder near the top of Crane's Hill in white canvas, set folding chairs in rows. Somebody had run a ribbon across 2 posts and laid out a line of gold-painted shovels like flatware at a wedding. The bee balm was up early on the south slope. Wild bergamot my grandmother let grow because the bees loved it. A wash of ragged purple running down toward the old fence line. I parked at the bottom, by the dead nursery sign. And walked up. Which gave me time to read the scene the way she taught me to read ground. 200 people, give or take. The town supervisor in a sport coat, a reporter from the Valley paper with a real camera, a folding table near the podium with sweating pitchers of water and a stack of programs. Status everywhere, the small town kind. The developer banner, the rendering of glassy townhomes on an easel, a microphone someone kept tapping. I had the survey tube under one arm and the trust folder in a plain envelope under the other. And the brass key on its green ribbon in my pocket. Because I wasn't going up that hill without her. Brandt saw me from the podium. Gave the smallest nod. Nobody else clocked me at first. I dressed plain, stayed at the edge. I found a spot by the canvas where I could see the front row. And there they were. My father, shaking hands like a man who'd already cashed the check. My mother, accepting congratulations with her chin up. My sister, angling her phone for the rendering behind her. They had no idea the ground they were standing on knew something they didn't. For a few minutes, I just watched them have their morning. It's a strange thing to see people celebrate on a fault line they don't know is there. My father had on the clean Carhartt jacket he saves for funerals and good news, working the crowd like a man laying pipe, telling anyone within reach that his excavation company was doing the whole site, ground floor, first shovel to last. My mother stood near the easel in her good coat. A woman from the church took both her hands and said how wonderful it was that the family land was going to something that would last. And my mother said, in the carrying voice she shares with my sister, "It's been in our family for generations. We knew it was time to let it grow into something." Generations. She said it like scripture. My sister was narrating to her phone, panning from the rendering to the shovels to her own face. I heard her tell the camera, "The family is so blessed to be part of bringing this to our town." Nobody mentioned me. Why would they? In the story they'd built, and the town had bought, I was the daughter who'd stolen from a dying woman and slunk off to scrub pots. Good people don't bring up the family thief at a ribbon cutting. So I stood at the edge of the tent. And let them have it. The congratulations, the generations, the blessed. Every word landing on a hill they did not own. I wasn't angry, exactly. 2 years burns the anger off. Leaves something steadier behind. I was just waiting. The way she taught me to wait. For the right person to reach for the microphone. At 10, the supervisor said a few words about progress and partnership. Then he handed the microphone to Marshall Brandt. And the crowd settled into the polite hush you give a man about to tell you good news. Brandt thanked the town. Talked for a minute about building something that fit the valley instead of bulldozing it. And then he stopped. Looked down at the gold shovels. And let the pause stretch a beat too long. The way you do when you're about to change the weather. "Before we put a shovel in this ground," he said, "I owe everyone here the truth, because I knew the woman this hill is named for, and she had no patience for anything else." A ripple went through the front row. My father's smile held. But his eyes went still. "There's a question of ownership on this parcel," Brandt said, even, unhurried. "That has to be settled in the open before this project takes one more step. It can't wait for a conference room. And the only person who can settle it is here this morning." 200 heads started turning. Looking for whoever that might be. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do. It went uncertain. A crack in the chin-up certainty she'd worn for 2 years. Brandt found me at the edge of the tent. He didn't point. He just looked. And the crowd followed his eyes to the woman by the canvas with a map tube under her arm. "Ince," he said into the microphone, gentle as anything, "would you come up here, please?" And I walked up the center aisle of my grandmother's hill. While the whole town remembered all at once exactly who I was supposed to be. I didn't take the microphone. I set the survey tube on the folding table. Uncapped it. Unrolled my grandmother's map across the wood. Weighted the corners. There were no jam jars this time. So I used the gold shovels, one to a corner. Which, I admit, pleased me. The crowd leaned in. Beside the map, I laid the trust, blue-backed, notarized. Turned so the reporter could read it. Then I spoke. And I kept my voice low enough that people had to quiet down to hear. Which my grandmother taught me works better than shouting ever has. "My name is Ince Thatcher. This is a survey of Cranes Hill, drawn before I was born. And this, I touched the deed, is the VC, Legacy Trust, recorded in 2011. The hill you're standing on has been held in that trust for 15 years. It has one beneficiary." I let that sit. Me. A sound moved through 200 people. Low, and rising. Brandt stepped to the mic. Confirmed it in 2 flat sentences. That Brandt Calder's title review had found the trust. That no valid sale of this parcel existed without the beneficiary's signature. And that he'd known the beneficiary's grandmother 40 years, and wasn't about to build on her ground by mistake. His project counsel stood from the front row. Said, for the record, and for the reporter, that the purchase agreement signed by my mother and father was void on its face. Because you cannot convey what you do not own. I looked down at the map. At the boundaries I'd recited as a girl. And I said the only thing that felt like hers. She told me once that land remembers. I think it just did. Then I looked up. At my mother. My mother came out of her chair. 2 years of chin-up control went up like dry grass. Right there in front of the supervisor, the reporter, the church committee, the whole town she'd recruited against me. "That's a lie," she said. Too loud. Then louder. She manipulated my mother. The words that had worked in 40 quiet phone calls landed differently. Shouted over a notarized deed. With the actual hill under everyone's feet. She heard it herself, I think. The way it curdled. But she couldn't stop. "My mother was never yours to take." She screamed it at me across the gold shovels. And 100 people flinched. And I understood. She'd finally said the true thing. In front of witnesses. That this was never about money. It was about who Vivian chose. My father grabbed her arm. And that was its own confession. The reporter's camera was up, clicking. And then my mother said the line that finished her. The house rule she'd recited to me on the porch in February. Except now she flung it across a public square. You don't steal from this family and keep eating. It hung there. In the warm air. Over the B-bomb. And you could watch 200 people do the math at the same time. That the woman screaming about stealing was the one who'd just been caught selling land she didn't own. And the thief was the one holding the deed. My father, cornered, blurted that they'd only taken the option money to cover the business. Which told everyone about the debt. My sister, sensing the floor tilt, started backing toward the parking lot. Already typing a different post. I didn't say a word through any of it. I'd learned the most useful thing a person can know in an argument. When the truth is on the table, you let the other person keep talking. The crowd had gone the particular kind of quiet that's worse than booing. And my mother stood in the middle of it. Her arm still in my father's grip. Breathing hard. Her story in pieces on the table next to the map. And then, for 1 second, the fight went out of her. And something underneath showed through. She never once said she was proud of me, my mother said. Not shouting now. Almost to herself. Almost to the hill. Not once in 60 years, and she gave you everything. I want to be fair to that moment. Because it was real. My grandmother was warm to me. And cool to her own daughter. And a child raised in that cold grows up into something bent. I felt the truth of it land in my chest. But feeling for someone is not the same as letting them keep their boot on your neck. And I'd spent 2 years learning the difference. So I didn't soften. And I didn't sneer. I just said it plainly, low, the way she taught me. I know, Mom, I'm sorry she did that to you. And then, because the second part mattered as much as the first, that was hers to fix, it was never mine to pay for. You took 2 years of my name, you don't get my future, too. She had no answer. There isn't one. My father let go of her arm. The supervisor was saying something about reconvening. The reporter was already on the phone. And I capped the survey tube. Picked up the deed. And walked back down the center aisle. Through people who would not meet my eyes. Off my grandmother's hill. Which was now, finally, and forever, mine. Here's where things landed. I kept the hill. The easy money was to sell the whole 22 acres to Brandt Calder and never work again. And for about a day, I considered it. But my grandmother didn't grow bee-balm for the bees so I could pave it for a quick payout. So I did the thing that felt like both of us. I put a conservation easement on the steep upper slope through the Valley Land Trust. Kept the nursery acreage. And worked out a deal with Brandt Calder to develop the buildable lower portion as a smaller, denser project, with a block of actually affordable housing. The kind this town pretends to want until someone proposes it nearby. The buildable rights appraised at a little over $3 million. The trust also held about $240,000 in cash my grandmother had quietly set aside. I'm not rich the way the billboard implied. I'm free the way a person is free when no one controls whether she eats. Once the trust distributed the hill to me, free and clear, Brandt Calder repapered the deal with its rightful owner. And Marshall offered me a real job. Project geotechnical engineer. The work I trained 6 years to do. I took it. And now I read the slopes I grew up reciting. My father's option money was gone. His crew didn't get the contract. Thatcher Excavation shrank to him and a backhoe inside a year. The town that wouldn't hire me suddenly remembered my number. A few of the people who'd passed on me called to apologize. I was polite. And I did not forget. My mother and I don't speak. My sister sent a long message about healing that I didn't answer. And on the first warm Saturday after the papers closed, I drove up the hill. Sat on my grandmother's porch. And brewed her lemon balm tea. Sharp and green and a little sweet. The way it took me 3 tries to get right. I still carry the brass key on the green ribbon. Even though the shed's mine now. And I never lock it. My grandmother couldn't protect my name while they dragged it through the town. So she protected my ground instead. 15 years early. In writing. Where no amount of forgetting on purpose could reach it. And that taught me the cleanest revenge isn't ruining the people who hurt you. It's simply standing in the open. And owning, out loud and on the record, the truth that was yours the whole time.